Good morning. The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing titled The International Space Station After 2024, Options and Impacts. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The International Space Station ranks among humanity's highest scientific, technological, and political achievements. As an internationally built and operated orbiting laboratory, the ISS conducts critical research that helps us both on Earth and in space. As a multinational project, this engineering marvel illustrates the power of U.S. leadership on the frontiers of exploration. However, frontiers are not static. NASA has worked hard to conquer the challenges of low Earth orbit. We have learned how the human body reacts to microgravity environment. We have grown food, crystallized proteins, launched satellites, and conducted scientific observations of the Earth and the stars above. What was once the height of technological daring nearly 2 decades ago has become almost ordinary. Once such pioneering challenges are overcome, it is time to re-examine where the frontier really lies. In 2015, Congress extended ISS operations until 2024. Congress recently passed, and the President just yesterday enacted the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017, which requires NASA to develop a transition plan for the ISS after 2024. NASA has estimated that the ISS will cost taxpayers between $3 and $4 billion annually through 2024, roughly half of NASA's total human spaceflight budget. A 2014 report from the NASA Inspector General calls this figure optimistic. That report also noted several hardware concerns, including the degradation of the station's solar power arrays. If NASA stays on the ISS beyond 2024, we ought to be aware that remaining on the ISS will come at a cost. That cost means trade-offs with other NASA priorities. Tax dollars spent on the ISS will not be spent on destinations beyond low Earth orbit, including the moon and Mars. What opportunities will we miss if we maintain this status quo? In its report, Pathways to Exploration, the National Academy stated that a continuation of flat budgets for human spaceflight is insufficient for NASA to execute any pathway to Mars and limits human spaceflight to LEO until after the end of the ISS program. And if you would put this slide up, please. As you can see on the screen, the longer we operate the ISS, the longer it will take to get to Mars. The ISS is there in the purple. You can see that. Subsequent reports, particularly by the Planetary Society and their Humans Orbit Mars report, evaluated different architectures and found that Mars exploration could be conducted with flat budgets, but that transitioning from the ISS in 2024 would be considerably better. Many private sector stakeholders currently rely on the ISS and would need to seek out other options if they can, should the ISS be unavailable. While I believe that it is in the nation's interest to encourage a thriving economy in space, we must balance our support for private sector efforts while also prioritizing NASA's role as an exploration agency. Can commercial use generate sufficient revenue by 2024 to cover the full cost of U.S. participation on the ISS? Could public-private partnerships or other novel approaches allow the U.S. to continue involvement in the ISS without tying up NASA funding? Will there be a sufficiently robust market that the U.S. will be able to procure service in low Earth orbit commercially? Or will the government need to continue to subsidize these activities in order to maintain access? Aside from private sector impacts, The international aspect is also a critical part of the puzzle. The European Space Agency has already shifted its focus from the ISS, changing its contribution from ISS resupply to collaborating with NASA on the Orion crew vehicle. Meanwhile, China will be putting their first space station into operation just as the presence of NASA and its international partners on the ISS could be ending, effectively turning over human presence and low Earth orbit to China. Continuing NASA's involvement on the ISS could arbitrarily limit or delay human exploration of deep space by the United States. Let us not forget that China also plans to launch a crewed mission to the moon in the 2030s. What we do in low Earth orbit will dramatically influence global efforts in our space exploration. I want to thank today's witnesses for being here, and we look forward to our discussions and having your answers to our questions. And let's see, now I want to recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from California, for an opening statement. Sorry about that, Mr. Barra.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this obviously very timely hearing, the ISS After 2024, Options and Impacts. I'd also like to welcome our witnesses, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. 220 miles above the Earth, the International Space Station, a complex assembly of interconnected nodes and modules weighing almost 1 million pounds and spanning the length of a football field, orbits our Earth 16 times a day. NASA and its international and commercial partners have overcome many challenges during the many years of design, development, and assembly to ensure the continued safe and productive operations of the space station. And I want to thank NASA's employees, supporting contractors, researchers, and partners for their continued dedication and commitment. This is a marvel of what we can do when we put our minds to a challenge. That said, the current mission, ISS Expedition 50, is testing lighting effects to improve crew health and investigating changes in tissue regeneration while in space, adding to a growing array of scientific, biomedical, and technology research being carried out on ISS. As NASA's focus has turned to vibrant research programs supported by a frequent schedule of visiting vehicles for crew transfer and cargo delivery, it is sometimes easy to forget how hard human spaceflight really is. Aboard the ISS, NASA is enabling the research, skills, and capabilities that our astronauts need for taking the next step, moving out into exploring deep space. Taking these steps is something the committee and Congress have supported through multiple NASA authorizations, most recently the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017 that is now law. Again, as we start to set our sights on sending humans beyond low Earth orbit, we also face some difficult funding decisions. Several independent panels have concluded that if we want to both extend the ISS past 2024 and undertake a meaningful human exploration program, we need to provide the required funding. Otherwise, we have to choose between NASA's extending the role of ISS past 2024 or reconsider our goals and expectations for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. The ISS is currently authorized to operate through at least 2024. Within the next few years, Congress will need to decide whether to extend the ISS beyond 2024 and what role NASA should have in low Earth orbit once ISS operations cease. So, Mr. Chairman, this obviously is a very timely discussion that we're having as we look at the broader NASA mission and, again, our stated goal of trying to get to human exploration and human travel to Mars by 2023. So I look forward, 2033. We could bump it up, though, Mr. Prom. So I look forward to this discussion this morning, and thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barra. Seeing that our full committee chair nor the ranking member are present, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our witnesses today. Our first witness is Mr. Bill Gerstenmaier, Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations at NASA. Mr. Gerstenmaier provides strategic direction for all aspects of NASA's human exploration of space and cross-agency space support functions, including programmatic direction for the operation and utilization of the International Space Station. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from Purdue University, a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Toledo. He also earned his PhD in Dynamics, so I apologize for not saying doctor, Dr. Gerstenmaier. He also earned his PhD in Dynamics and Control with emphasis on propulsion at Purdue University. So we're glad to have you here. Dr. Lynne Dittmar, our second witness today, Executive Director of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. We appreciate you being here. The Coalition for Deep Space Exploration is an industry trade group supporting human exploration, development in science and deep space. Dr. Dittmar has worked for the Boeing Company, where she coordinated research and development and managed the flight operations group for the International Space Station program. She has also served as a senior policy advisor for the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space, or CASIS, which manages the ISS National Laboratory. Dr. Dittmar is also a fellow of the National Research Society, an associate fellow for AIAA, and a board member of AAS, and was a co-author of the Pathways to Exploration report produced by the NRC in 2014. Glad to have you here. And our third witness today is Mr. Eric Stallmer, President of Commercial Spaceflight Federation. Mr. Stallmer has worked at the Space Transportation Association, a nonprofit industry trade organization providing government representation to companies interested in the U.S. space launch industry. Glad to have you here this morning. Mr. Stallmer has also served as an officer in the United States Army Reserves and was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service while engaged in combat operations during Operation Iraqi Freedom. He earned a Master of Arts in Public Administration from George Mason University and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and History from the Mount St. Mary College. Glad to have you here. Our fourth witness today is Dr. Robert Ferl. He is Distinguished Professor and Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Biotechnology Research at the University of Florida. Dr. Ferl co-chairs the Committee on Biological and Physical Sciences in Space for the National Academies of Science and is the past president of the American Society for Gravitational and Space Research. Dr. Ferl and his lab have studied the aspects of microgravity environment as well as developed flight hardware for understanding biological effects of space flight. I now recognize Dr. Gerstenmaier for five minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the committee for having me here. You were correct originally. I completed coursework for my PhD, but I never received my PhD. So Mr. is good, and it works well. The International Space... I don't know about that. So the International Space Station is about humanity's future in space. It also tells us about the roles major players participated in helping us to get there. ISS is the most complex engineering complex ever constructed. As an engineer, I'm tempted to quote numbers: 37 space shuttle flights, 1,000 hours of EVAs or spacewalks, 197 spacewalks, both US and Russian, 12 years to build, $67 billion, including the shuttle launch costs, and a mass of 925,000 pounds. The scale of what we've accomplished is enormous. Like the interstate highway system, it was designed to move our nation forward, and it could not have been done without public investment. As a high-tech space flight endeavor, ISS has changed the way the nation thinks about space. We've shown that humans can live off the Earth for extended periods of time. There's been a continuous human presence off the Earth for over 16 years. We can assemble large structures in space via humans in spacesuits. We've changed the way that robotics can be used for assembly in space. All of the recent SpaceX external payloads were installed on the ISS via ground-controlled robotics. And the 3 external payloads were removed from the space station and installed in the SpaceX trunk for disposal, all again through ground robotics. SpaceX was even birthed to the space station via ground control and not by astronauts on board. ISS created the need for NASA to accept alternate engineering standards from a variety of countries. This allowed NASA to build techniques to accept alternate commercial standards for commercial vehicles. Today, ISS represents 13% of the total global launches to space. The relaxed reliability requirements for ISS cargo allowed for disruption of the U.S. launch industry and resulted in lower launch costs for all users and return of commercial satellite launches to the United States. One of the most enduring outcomes from the ISS is the ability for the governments of the U.S., Japan, Russia, Europe, and Canada to work together peacefully in space. ISS has paved the way for international operations with 225 people from 18 countries having visited the International Space Station. This cooperation is much more than simply working together. We are dependent on each other for successful operations. The intergovernmental agreements developed to make this happen are phenomenal in their simplicity and the ability to facilitate real-time operations of this incredibly complex facility. These arrangements paved the way for future exploration and allowed for the European Service Module to become part of Orion. Although the cost, effort, and resources to build this facility was high, this is precisely the role of large government activities. The diversity of benefits from a single activity are enormous. The private sector could have done some of the individual items in part, but not the entire suite of accomplishments, and not with such broad national benefit. The role of government is to do things that the private sector cannot, so both commerce and the broader society will have more opportunities in the future. As we go forward, how do we build off of the ISS achievement and utilize the International Space Station to strengthen the role of the U.S. as a leader in space and technology? The focus needs to be on using the ISS for the full range of national purposes, both of those predicted in advance and those that we discover through its use. It's great to have this hearing today and discuss better uses of the ISS. How we utilize the ISS through 2024 can influence the options and impacts for ISS after 2024. The promise of ISS to continue to yield national benefits is high. We are exploring today with the ISS by using it to test out systems, both human and machine, and understand how those systems will work when applied to deep space exploration missions. ISS is perfect for that role. The use of ISS as our national laboratory in space to help develop the private sector demand and revenue for space-based activities as NASA prepares for deep space exploration will be critical to U.S. leadership in science and technology. We are today formulating plans to make available a port on the ISS for private sector use. We are looking at legislative proposals to help facilitate commercial uses of ISS. All of these activities are just starting and will be critical to advancing U.S. leadership. The external world is not static, and China's plans for human space exploration are also likely to influence the options for the ISS. China is planning for a government space station in 2023. As NASA progresses towards moving human spaceflight into the solar system, the rate of this expansion will also be an influence on the operations and options for ISS. The continuity of human spaceflight from ISS in low Earth orbit to regular missions of SLS and Orion to cislunar space is a critical requirement feature for U.S. leadership in space. A continuous U.S. national astronaut program is part of this leadership. The decision to extend the ISS to 2024 showed great leadership by the administration and Congress. This decision was made without full knowledge of the future, but is proving to keep the U.S. in a leadership role for space technology development and to the benefit of both U.S. commerce and broader national goals. Likewise, the decisions for ISS after 24 will be made without all of the data on future benefits required for a perfect decision. But we can today utilize ISS in ways that influence that decision towards a greater national benefit. Global leadership requires decisions with less than perfect data or foresight, but that's what leadership is all about. Where the U.S. leads, others will follow, and the future will be shaped by American values. I look forward to your questions and discussions in the hearing today, and I thank you for the timely discussion on this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. Now recognize Dr. Dittmar for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Barra, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on a subject of great importance to our national leadership in space, the future of the International Space Station after 2024. It is indeed an honor to appear before you, and particularly in the company of this distinguished panel. Before I begin, I would like to congratulate you and the committee staff on passage of the NASA Transition Authorization Act signed into law yesterday by the President. On behalf of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration and its 67 member companies, I want to thank you personally for your diligence and your ongoing support of the nation's space program. In 2014, in response to a request from Congress, the Committee for Human Spaceflight of the National Research Council produced the Pathways to Exploration report, which contained observations and recommendations supporting a robust program of human space exploration. Among other findings, the report described the funding constraints facing NASA should the ISS continue to operate after 2024, namely that if NASA is to continue making progress in deep space, it could not maintain the ISS without significant cost reductions. The committee discussed the role of ISS research in reducing risk in deep space exploration and understood that termination of the program would end opportunities for continued research in these areas, as well as potentially cut short the research benefiting Earth going on at the ISS National Lab. Fortunately, thanks to Congress, in the 3 years since the report was published, NASA's human spaceflight program funding has improved. And in my written testimony, I provide a modification of the chart that you showed earlier, Chairman, that showed that line inching up a little bit there. However, the larger point remains. One potential avenue for reducing the government's investment in the ISS is by generating alternate sources of revenue. However, at present, there is no compelling economic driver apparent in LEO that can bridge the gap between current commercial activity and the revenues that are necessary to significantly offload ISS operations costs. Given that markets frequently take decades to develop, this is not surprising. The best answer for now is to create the optimal conditions for market breakthroughs, reducing barriers to the use of the ISS while working hard to enable innovation with economic value to occur, and recognizing that this will take time and ongoing investment. And indeed, this is what NASA and CASIS have been doing. In my written statement, I noted the significant progress being made in this regard. The growing number of applications and paying customers in space, combined with an increased diversification of research objectives, funding sources, and actors, improves the odds that one or more of these efforts will lead to sustained economic activity. And indeed, applications with strong market potential are emerging, which in turn are leading to increased interest in the development of commercial modules and follow-on platforms. These efforts will not guarantee development of a market or establishment of sufficient revenues or investment to offload the government and reduce costs. However, abandoning the ISS too soon will most certainly guarantee failure. I would like to briefly turn to the importance of the ISS to deep space exploration. First, the international partnership already mentioned at the heart of the ISS is a major building block for an international program to move humans off the Earth toward Mars. The ISS has demonstrated that a great multilateral enterprise such as this one brings to the table intellectual capital, scientific abilities, research, engineering, funding, and interest in peaceful technology development on the part of many nations. We have come to trust each other, to learn from each other, and to depend on each other for our very lives in low Earth orbit. It will be the same in deep space. Continuing engagement with partners old and new through the ISS is required at least until such time as a robust international program is also established beyond low Earth orbit. Secondly, innovation on the ISS has the potential to create breakthroughs that will inform deep space exploration and reduce costs there as well. A company called Made in Space is experimenting with 3D printing in LEO, but wants to extend this work into deep space, including on the surface of the Moon and Mars. The ability to manufacture tools and other equipment from native materials can reduce mass requirements and therefore cost for deep space missions. Other innovations are likely to follow. Third, NASA is now putting in place the exploration architecture that will take us out into the solar system. The next steps will help inform the uses of the ISS and helping that architecture to progress, doubtless in some ways that we cannot now anticipate. A good example of this is using the ISS as a technical testbed for systems that don't always work the way we think they're going to once they're put into space. The Environmental Life Control System, or ECLSS, is very high on that list, but as we move into deep space, there will be others. Finally, the next 2 years or so will see the return of Americans on American launch vehicles to the ISS, and we'll see the return of Americans to deep space on American systems built for that purpose for the first time in almost 50 years. The ISS is the heartbeat of human spaceflight, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. American leadership in space requires a constant and vigilant presence, one that the ISS has provided during the gap in our own flight access. Learning from history, we should not step away from the ISS until a robust human spaceflight program has been established in cislunar space. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dittmar. Now I recognize Mr. Stallmer for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I want to thank you and Ranking Member Barra and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to present the Commercial Spaceflight Federation's views on the ISS after 2024. CSF represents 70-plus companies and tens of thousands of employees dedicated to America's future in space. In my testimony, I will lay out a sustainable vision, not just for human spaceflight in low Earth orbit, but for America's broader and deeper space ambitions. This discussion is not just about the value of ISS in and of itself, or even in NASA's exploration agenda for the Moon, Mars, and beyond. The right yardstick is America's future economic development and settlement of space, starting with LEO, but expanding outward. Clearly, we want our first and long-term international space station to be a firm stepping stone to that grander future. By next year, for the first time in U.S. history, our space program will have multiple means of safely and affordably getting science experiments, other cargo, and crew to space. The ISS is currently expected to be utilized through at least 2024, but this committee is posing the question of what should occur after. And my testimony will focus on 3 of these areas. First, the ISS should be sustained beyond 2024 to the extent that the space station is technically capable and safe to remain in orbit. In addition, rather than abruptly ending such a major program without a functional successor, any ISS transition plan should prepare an evolutionary path in order to avoid disrupting science and operations on orbit and any unnecessary economic upheaval to local economies. Second, to maximize return on investment for the nation, commercial utilization of the ISS should be expanded, and NASA should take full advantage of these opportunities to offset some of the costs to maintain the space station. NASA should use public-private partnerships to develop commercial space capabilities and services to support its cislunar activities, and should use commercial launch systems to support and augment these activities. The International Space Station is one of the greatest achievements of our time. It's an engineering marvel built and operated in concert with our partners around the world. It's a treasured national lab contributing to key scientific breakthroughs in science and research, and it represents the longest ever sustained human presence in space. It's the foundation of humanity's voyage to the stars, and the commercial spaceflight industry is proud to play a key role in its continued success. And given this incredible investment that we made, we need to ensure that we are maximizing our scientific and economic return from this unique asset. We are grateful for the committee and the Congress's recognition of the value of the Space Act agreements, which has helped further along the transportation goals for the ISS, and for your support in the important tool in this recent NASA authorization bill. SpaceX, as well as a growing number of new American commercial launch companies, are recapturing a majority of the world's multi-billion-dollar commercial launch market after years in which the U.S. was simply not competitive. And the same Space Act agreement partnered with NASA is going to also help restore getting American astronauts on American vehicles from American soil. The private sector has jumped at the opportunity to support research on the ISS. Companies like Bigelow Aerospace, Planet, and NanoRacks are testing new technologies like inflatable habitats to help us go deep into space, developing new generations of advanced satellites, and opening up opportunities to a broader utilization community to fly thousands of experiments. Understandably, in this era of fiscal constraints, it's prudent to review opportunities that exist to introduce additional efficiencies. But to be very clear, the ISS and NASA's deep space exploration programs are not in competition, but rather complementary. Opening the ISS to private businesses now and continuing this agenda past 2024 will deliver an assured transition to a sustained private American presence in low Earth orbit that can untether NASA from the fixed costs of the future space stations while continuing to make capabilities available whenever needed. The same technologies being developed for use to travel and operating on ISS today, as well as other commercial capabilities, will enable us to sustainably go deeper in space than ever before. We must leverage the commercial capabilities, both those being proven out on ISS as well as those under development. Blue Origin, right now has announced that it's developing its own deep space exploration architecture and has proposed to conduct what it's calling Blue Moon by 2020, a lunar lander that will touch down on the resource-rich crater on the moon's south pole. This program would augment and enable NASA's lunar activities. We have also heard that SpaceX, which has recently announced a privately funded mission to Mars in 2020 on the Red Dragon spacecraft, a derivative of the Crew Dragon spacecraft they will be using to fly NASA astronauts. Made in Space, as Mary Lynne had mentioned, is already manufacturing on ISS and is developing advanced commercial on-orbit manufacturing services and products for use in space and on Earth. And Moon Express has announced that it has the resources it needs to ensure that the company can attempt to launch a small robotic lander to the moon as soon as the end of this year. In conclusion, how should Congress enable a sustainable, robust space enterprise, one that will continue to foster the burgeoning commercial activity in low Earth orbit, but also enable the United States to make meaningful progress in deep space? The answer is short. It's to expand the use of public-private partnerships with the American commercial space companies. Through private sector competition, investment, and innovation, the commercial space industry has proven it can deliver reliable, affordable goods and services that support U.S. government civil space missions and initiatives, as well as recapture global market share. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stallmer. Now I recognize Dr. Ferl for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this morning from the scientist perspective of life and physical sciences as they both enable deep space exploration and are enabled by the unique opportunities of understanding physical and life processes in the absence of gravity. I speak to you today as a scientist with more than 25 years of experience in the broader areas of spaceflight research, using many of the platforms, flights, and tools that have been available to spaceflight research over this time. My research is dedicated to understanding the molecular and physiological effects of spaceflight on terrestrial life forms in order to develop safer deep space capabilities for human exploration. My comments today are also informed by my roles with the National Academies. I was a member of the writing committee for the NRC study that ended up being called Recapturing a Future for Space Exploration, Life and Physical Sciences for a New Era. That was published in 2011. And I wish to share with you a very positive view regarding the current status and activities on the ISS. A view, in fact, deeply enriched by experiments over the last few weeks conducted on the space station, monitored in real time from Kennedy Space Center 3 weeks ago with Peggy Whitson doing our stuff on orbit. We spent last week at Glenn Research Center downloading in real time information from the light microscopy module on orbit, and our samples landed in the Pacific this weekend. I can tell you there's essentially no better time to be a spaceflight researcher than right now, given the capabilities of the International Space Station. The demonstration and the evolution of the quality of experiments as they've moved from the early days in the space shuttle era into the space station era is dramatic, and the kinds and difficulties and opportunities of science in the space station are remarkable. The space life and physical sciences are governed, enabled by, and monitored and managed by the Space Life and Physical Sciences Research and Applications Division of NASA. I wish to give my thanks to NASA for standing up that division. That division was stood up in alignment with the decadal study and has reinvigorated the scientific community such that we can indeed talk about the science of space and spaceflight now in ways that were not available in the years past. They've done a great job getting our community back up and running and doing the science in support of the exploration agenda. The ISS is currently the only space-based platform that provides extended access to the spaceflight environment, and as such provides the only means to assess the long-term effects of this environment on terrestrial organisms and the physical systems that would be used to support them. Such data are crucial to inform and more fully inform the deep space exploration ideas such as missions to Mars. I wish to stress that the ISS is now a fully functional laboratory with trained personnel that are interested in science and that are doing the business of science on a daily basis in space. A shift to private sector platform providers as part of the increasingly privatized LEO ecosystem could be a part of a successful microgravity program, provided that NASA's stewardship of this portfolio of research is maintained. They've been great stewards of the science that it takes to move humans into deep space, and they've been doing that on the International Space Station, and any movement away from the International Space Station would be enhanced greatly, but mostly only if NASA and Space Life and Physical Sciences within NASA remain stewards of this portfolio of research. There are important things for Congress to look at as we move forward towards the dates, such as 2024, is crew time on orbit. As I mentioned, the access to the special laboratories that are represented in the International Space Station are enabled by a highly active and highly integrated, interested, and capable crew there. So crew time on orbit is something that the committee and Congress should be very much aware of, and in any notions of projecting whether we'll be, quote, ready to enter deep space will be sort of deeply affected by how much crew time is dedicated to science between now and that time. So I wish to thank you again for the opportunity to present. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ferl. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. This first one is to Dr. Dittmar. China plans to send a crewed mission to the moon in the 2030s. The European Space Agency has discussed a moon village. Assuming flat budgets, how is America's leadership in space impacted by continuing the ISS into 2028 or even into 2030? For every year we extend the ISS, are we delaying the development of new deep space projects by a year?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I don't know about the one-to-one relationship that you just described, which is that for every year that station continues to fly, there's a delay by a year. I would not really know how to go about answering that question. What I would say is that there is no question that under a flat budget, you're basically in a zero-sum game unless you're able to find ways to offset that game with either significant cost reductions or the influx of additional revenue from some source, whether that source is coming from commercial ventures or whether it's coming by contributions of international partners or in some other way. So with regard to continuing to fly the ISS and while still planning to move into cislunar space and begin to generate activities there, what's going to happen, okay, is that the things I was already sort of talking about in testimony. In order for the station to continue, you're going to have to find ways to reduce costs. The clearest way that we see that happening right now is through the advent of things like public-private partnerships, which Eric mentioned, as a way of sort of doing acquisition that's a little bit different. We need acquisition reform in general, and so that's one path to be able to reduce costs. Continuing to encourage the existing partners who are developing, corporate partners who are with NASA who are developing deep space exploration activities to find ways to reduce costs in production as well as in operations is another way to reduce costs, try and get costs down on that end as opposed to the ISS end. I think the thing that's most important is to look at the entire portfolio of activities that NASA is considering and try and find opportunities for cost reduction everywhere along the way. I think we make a bit of a mistake. We're not thinking about things systematically if we're just focusing on reducing costs associated with ISS. I think we have to look at it across the board. Where can we find cost reductions in the entire human spaceflight enterprise and/or opportunities to bring in additional revenues across that entire spaceflight enterprise? And I think that's what we really have to focus on, and NASA has to focus on very carefully.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Stallmer, NASA has invested a lot of money in the United States commercial space companies in the hopes of developing a self-sustaining space infrastructure. Could the ISS be self-sustaining without NASA subsidizing transportation or operations costs? Do any of your members have plans to offer low Earth orbit space station services in the near term, absent NASA development funding?
That's a great question. I appreciate that. I think as Mary Lynne had said earlier, echoing the public-private partnerships that NASA has engaged in with the commercial sector, I think we are already seeing the NASA investment in these partnerships are already paying huge dividends. We're seeing this in the cost to access to space with the Commercial Crew Program, the tremendous reduction in costs that has afforded NASA, as well as coming online next year, the Commercial Crew Program that will be returning astronauts to the space station. Those are already yielding great benefits for NASA. I see also the value of what a lot of the commercial companies are doing currently on the space station with, most recently, the investment that Bigelow Aerospace has made with the module that they attach to the space station. I think that you're going to see commercial benefits yielded from that, not just on the space station, but for future missions outside and off the space station. And also the manufacturing that we'll see, the potential there. A very, very small investment that NASA made years ago, just a few years ago, on 3D printing with Made in Space and the benefits that is reaping right now. So I'm very excited about the returns that NASA will see from the investment in the commercial community.
Thank you very much. And then finally, Mr. Gerstenmaier, at a 2015 NASA Advisory Council meeting, you were quoted as saying, "We're going to get out of ISS as quickly as we can, whether it gets filled in by the private sector or not. NASA's vision is we're trying to move out." Is this statement still accurate?
I think the accuracy in the statement or the discussion is really, we need to do a transition. As was described in some of the earlier testimony, it's not good to end space station and then try to start exploration. There needs to be a smooth handoff from the one activity on space station to the exploration activity moving forward. I think it's also wrong to assume that exploration and ISS are competing with each other. They're really helping each other. We're working today on space station to understand the physiological problems of being in microgravity on the human body. Those are not fully resolved yet. We just recently discovered several years ago the intracranial pressure problem that causes vision problems on station. If that was not discovered on space station, we would have carried that potentially with us into Moon, Mars activities, and it could have been detrimental to our crews.
Yep.
So that work and that research is absolutely critical to what we're doing going forward. We're also testing Orion life support systems today on station. So I think there's a transition. But I think NASA's predominant role should be to move to deep space, take the private sector along with us to deep space, and continue that activity moving forward. And to do that, we need to relinquish the NASA role in low Earth orbit. So it's a natural transition. It's not quite as stark as maybe it was described in the quotes that you previously read to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerstenmaier. I now recognize Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think Mr. Gerstenmaier, and actually all of you talked about the remarkable engineering accomplishment of the International Space Station. In addition, it was a remarkable accomplishment of different governments working together, finding that cooperation. That's going to be necessary as we go on to our next mission into deep space. So I think that's as equally a remarkable achievement. In your comments, this is not an abrupt let's stop in 2024. This should be a transition as we move from one mission to the next mission. And if we've got a workable asset that still is safe and can be used, we clearly, there's clear scientific value in continuing to use that asset. And I have to imagine there's commercial interest in how you use that asset. So I think for this body, as we start to think about this transition, it shouldn't be an either or. It should be, how do we broaden and bring in other partners? I think, Dr. Dittmar, you talked a little bit about this. You can either lower costs or increase revenue, or do both simultaneously, which is what you do in the private sector and what we ought to be thinking about doing here. In your view, or Mr. Stallmer, is there sufficient commercial or academic interest that could start raising revenue, or even international interest, other companies that have growing interest in space, like India and others who may want to bring in additional partners here? And Dr. Dittmar.
One of the things that's really interesting when you take a look at the ISS in terms of the utilization of it is the growth curve, which is astonishing over the last 10 years. I started a few companies, and if I had gone from 4 or 5, well, 15 originally, countries who were originally engaged in the ISS to over 100, given all the barriers that are involved in flying to the ISS and actually doing operations in station, these are really significant. It's not the same as doing work here on Earth. When I was preparing for this testimony, I went and looked at one interest I have is the amount of time that it takes for technology, once it's introduced, to basically kick off a market. And those numbers sort of average around 15 to 20 years, but they can be even longer. So, for example, the interval between the invention of the integrated circuit and the iPhone is about 49 years. We think about these things as though they occurred very closely in time, but they didn't. 27 years ago, we began the Human Genome Project. And despite the fact that we have basically unraveled the genome and are now doing a lot of research in that area, we still don't have the cure for cancer. However, we've grown a lot of markets that have developed off of that research, a lot of which couldn't originally been predicted when you looked at the original definition of trying to define the genome. So the point I'm basically trying to make is, I think that it's impossible to predict, commercial activity that's based on research and innovation. What we do know are the kinds of conditions that you can create to help bring that about. And I think that NASA and CASIS and other entities have done, international partners, have done a fantastic job in trying to lower the barriers to the use of ISS and create that sort of environment. So I think there are a growing number of commercial companies. Right now there's 6 companies flying on board the station with their own commercial facilities with paying customers. That's a huge change from 10 years ago. And there's certainly a lot of companies that are interested in developing a commercial module. Eric mentioned Bigelow, there's Axiom, there's some other companies that are trying to do that. And then there's international, as I mentioned, international participation, which has grown to over 100. So I think that what we really have to do is look at the trend lines, which are all very positive. But if you're going to ask me to predict a date and a time when that would happen, I'm not able to do that.
And we certainly shouldn't predict that date and time. It may happen sooner than 2024, which allows us to free up additional resources to do other missions. Mr. Stallmer, just playing off of Dr. Dittmar, it does seem like there's that interest. If we created that space for the commercial sector, again, they may not know exactly what they're going to do, but there's an interest in using this asset and the potential for generating revenue to offset the cost of operating ISS. Is that an accurate statement?
I think that's a very accurate statement. I think you're seeing work being developed on the ISS by companies, some that didn't even exist a decade ago. And the technologies that they are doing and learning, and the research that they're learning from the microgravity experience that they have. We touched on a few of them, but I see the manufacturing that is going to go on the space station. It really is a tremendous building block of what we're going to do, and it's just critical that any deep space exploration that we're going to do down the future. We're developing that technology and research now on the station.
So we don't know what 2024 looks like, but we do know there's a curiosity and a desire, and we ought to create that space for other international partners or commercial partners to explore that space.
And there's investment.
Great.
There's commercial investment. That's, I think, the most important takeaway.
Absolutely. Great. I'll yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize other members for questions, and we'll start with the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies, ma'am, gentlemen, thank you for appearing before the committee. Thank you for the work that you do for our nation and indeed our world. This committee is certainly committed to the revitalization of NASA's manned space program. Keeping that in mind, we're also committed and indeed bound in our duty to protect and be careful stewards of the people's treasure. So considering the fact that that new technologies are developed every day, technologies like carbon nanotubes, which have, you know, the diameter of 10,000 times less than that of a human hair. They're stronger than steel and have the stiffness properties of diamond. 3D printers, which are developing quite remarkable products every day with new technologies across the world. It leads one to wonder, considering although the unbelievably successful service that the existing International Space Station has rendered to America and the world, leads one to wonder whether or not the continued investment beyond 2024 in the ISS is reasonable. On the other hand, the same technologies that are being developed, which could ultimately lead to perhaps a next generation International Space Station, will also present us new opportunities to extend the life of the existing space station. So my question, first to Mr. Gerstenmaier, specifically regarding manned space flight and deep space exploration for an American space program led by NASA, do you envision beyond 2024 the existent ISS to be in any way useful for that manned space exploration, or does it have a role? Do you envision that role? And if so, please explain, and if not, please expound.
Yeah, I believe the station has a critical role in exploration as we have technical challenges that we have to conquer or overcome as we go beyond low Earth orbit. The requirements to keep technology highly reliable with low resources, to be essentially break the tie back to the planet Earth. Space station is resupplied all the time today by cargo vehicles to and from the Earth. But as we move human presence deeper into the solar system, we need to break that tie back with Earth. And the space station is a great test bed to test that technology, to understand the next generation of life support systems. We tested the systems for many years on the ground terrestrially before we took them to the space station. They did not work nearly as well in space as we had anticipated because of the loss of gravity. The carbon dioxide removal system is still a problematic system for us on board space station. We can operate it and keep it working well, but it's not easy. We need to use the unique properties of space station to actually test that next generation of life support systems. Understanding how the human performs in space is important. And understanding even how we break that tie and we keep sensors like oxygen measurement devices calibrated for years without returning to the ground for recalibration. So I think station plays a pretty critical role. I don't think we'll have all those technology challenges done. We're going to need some facility in space beyond 2024 to keep working those items as we break the tie of the planet and move human presence further into the solar system.
Dr. Dittmar, would you comment on that question, please?
Sorry. I don't think there's any disagreement that we have to move off station. I think the only issue is when and how and what needs to happen between now and then. So it's already been talked about that there has to be a transition plan of some type. I don't know about you, but I really like a certain amount of certainty. As a business owner in particular, I like it when I can predict outcomes. I don't like it when I can't predict outcomes. This is one of those circumstances where you just can't really predict the outcomes. We do know that there are certain things that have to happen, right? We have to meet as many of the research objectives that are involved in going to deep space as we possibly can. And NASA, in fact, has a risk matrix that it's been burning down, okay, doing that kind of research. We know that we want to enable researchers like Dr. Ferl to be able to do as much research as they can, and we want to establish some mechanism for them to be able to continue to do that research after we're finished with ISS. We know that for all the reasons that Bill just talked about and that Eric just talked about, we want to be able to continue to have facilities available for people to do commercial development as well as to be able to test systems that we need to go into deep space. So the only real question is, how do we get from here to there, right? I mean, that's the question. That's the one that's sort of facing everybody. The kinds of things that we know we want to allow for more time for have to do with commercial development, the kinds of things that we've already been discussing here, learning what kinds of systems work we may need to do as we go forward into deep space. So do I think that this is a value to the nation to continue doing this? I certainly do. The unique properties of microgravity are things that we're just still starting to, I mean, we're really just early in trying to figure those out. Think about when radiation was discovered and all the things that we've learned about what to do with that in the years since, right? We have no idea when we first started. That was a unique physical property, right? What we've learned to do with that in the decades and decades since is extraordinary. It actually is in most aspects of our lives. So I think that I hate to counsel patience, but I'm going to counsel patience. We need a little bit more time, I think, to allow these things to develop before we can get a real clear view of what that transition looks like.
That was a very helpful response. Thank you both, ma'am, gentlemen, for appearing today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I thank our witnesses for their testimony today. I want to ask Mr. Stallmer and Dr. Dittmar, can you speak to the readiness of the private sector to fly its own modules in low Earth orbit without NASA assistance or physical attachment to the ISS? And then can you talk about what roles have NASA and ISS played thus far, and what role can and should it play in the future for this? Mr. Stallmer?
I'll just take quickly. I think what you're seeing right now with the flying of modules and the role of NASA and commercial is a tremendous partnership. It's a partnership that I think can't have one without the other. And I think what the assistance that NASA is providing is the technical assistance and some of the resources that are enabling these technologies to kind of crawl, walk, run. As I mentioned earlier, we saw this with Bigelow, and we're seeing this with the possibilities of Exiom and what they're looking to do. You know, time is going to be the best indicator of how this is going to happen and how we can move away to, you know, purely commercial space stations. I feel that the stepping stone that what is ISS and what they're doing is critical, and I think that partnership with NASA and the technology transfer and the investment that they're making intellectually is really critical.
Thank you. Dr. Dittmar?
I don't have much to add to that, except to say that there are things about learning how to operate in space that you can only learn by operating in space. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. So when it comes to the development of commercial modules, I think that there are folks that are doing some really great work in thinking about how it is that they want to develop those. But a stepping stone approach where you have attachment to the station, for example, and you've got essentially the station resources available to you, the station knowledge available to you, that's a reasonable approach. If you had a commercial provider that really wanted to go try and do it all, I'd be a little concerned about that. Only because I think that there's a unique knowledge set that just has to do with operations. It's different than launch. It's different than landing. All of these things are a little bit different. So the partnership that NASA affords, I think, in developing those kinds of capabilities and sort of handing over that knowledge that's been developed over all these years, I think is critical to commercial success. Really important to those people who were wanting to go in that direction, and it's wonderful that NASA makes that available.
So will the ISS or a replacement and NASA work in cooperation with commercial operations? Will it always be necessary in order for this to be viable, or do we not know?
Always is such a tricky word. And as I said, you know, it's a timetable.
That's why I said we probably don't really know.
Yeah, so I do see that the greater role that commercial is going to play, and I think, as we say, these stepping stones, as we are making these technological breakthroughs at the ISS through microgravity, I see a greater interest in the investment community of enabling more commercial companies to do this, and whether it's on medical research or just technologies that will be applicable here on the ground. I think that you'll only see that growing, and with time, you'll see the commercial impact on the station grow.
Anyone else want to add anything on that? All right, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I spent the last few years on the board of Space Florida, very much a commercial sort of focused entity, and with some pride, we like to say we actually ran that thing in the black. So it's so I know there is a commercial niche for space. I'd like to sort of focus, as the last gentleman did, on the commercial niches of the ISS specifically. So let me start with Mr. Stallmer. Can you quantify for me the likelihood that the ISS would be supported entirely by commercial partners by 2024 or at any other time frame?
I think it'd be hard to speculate by 2024. I think the commercial sector is moving in the right direction with NASA to fully privatize the station. It would be difficult, but because I think you do need that expertise that NASA offers. But I see more and more breakthroughs, and it's going on in your state with the onset of the commercial crew program and the doubling of the crew that will be able to do more and more work on the station. I think that will move the ball in the right direction to a greater and greater commercial percentage to allow NASA to do those.
Can you quantify, give me a percentage you think we can get to? Is it 50-50, 70%?
I would love to see 50-50. I think that would be a great starting off point and move in a higher direction.
Dr. Dittmar, your same question. Likelihood or what, commercial balance versus NASA in the ISS?
Very difficult to quantify it. What I would point out.
That's what we have to do, though. You're going to help us.
I understand. One of the things I would point out is that the cost of ISS, when we talk about the operations, we're talking about transportation as well as the actual operation of the vehicle, right? So let's assume for a moment, let's do a thought experiment, and let's just say that you're able to generate commercial revenue sufficient to support the entire operating cost of the vehicle itself, the M&O of the vehicle itself. That still leaves you right now, Bill's going to probably correct me if I'm wrong here, about $1.7 billion of transportation costs roughly, which I would assume would go up over time. So one of the questions really is when are you generating enough business that you can start shifting the transportation costs back to the people who are actually generating the business? In other words, pay for your ride, right?
Yes.
And that's for me actually even a more important question than the actual operations and the M&O part of the station. I think that's a difficult one to call because in part it's not just the U.S., right? There's an international component to that. I think it's around $500 million is being contributed right now by the international partners. So I'm much more interested in when you can start getting payback on the transportation end, personally.
Good question. Good point. Thank you very much. Again, Mr. Stallmer, so how disrupting would it be to the commercial space industry to lose the ISS if you just lost it entirely?
I think tremendously disruptive.
Can you quantify that?
100%. We would lose.
That's what we're talking about here at the end, right?
That's a number. We would lose our outposts in space. We're doing all the low Earth orbit experimentation, all the advanced sciences. I mean, to lose the ISS would be critical. In part on the transportation sector of where we're going in space. It would, I think, infringe tremendously on our ambitions as a nation for deep space exploration.
Okay, Dr. Ferl, are you doing any commercial research, or is it pure science? I know, by the way, right near my district at home there. But thanks, so nice to have you here. Any commercial-based research?
The simple answer to that question is yes. We've seen as a
Well, I only have a minute, so
yeah.
keep it simple.
We've seen from the community over time increased interest in the industrial, private, commercial sector in doing experiments on station. By nature, those experiments involve scientists. Some of those scientists are within the company, and some of those scientists are contracted by the company. Are
you working on the commercialization of a product by any chance?
People are, yes.
People are, okay.
Am I? No.
No, okay. Well, that's good. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And thank you all for your work.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter. No, we can't wait. I'm sorry. No. Then I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And I have actually a question for Dr. Ferl, my fellow Floridian. I was curious, you know, there's a lot of discussion, obviously, today about the International Space Station. There's also a lot of discussion about a potential mission to Mars. And I noticed that in some of your work, you've looked into, let me get my eyes back on, the Houghton Mars Project in the Arctic is some of your body of work. And I was just curious if you had to prioritize between continuing the International Space Station beyond 2024 or pursuing getting to Mars sooner. How would you prioritize those two if you would? Or do you think it's just as important to simultaneously pursue both?
I would agree with my compatriot from the other end of the table here who says there has to be a transition and basically a dual-use appreciation for all the science that occurs in space. The notion that the station stands sort of alone as the way in which we derive scientific benefit for the trip to Mars is too simplistic. And by the way, touching the commercial sector are all the other vehicles that also currently inform scientific research for that mission to Mars. Suborbital space, parabolic flight, commercial providers now are giving science the opportunity to develop the processes, experiences, and data that it takes to get us to Mars. So the long way around to answering your question is I wouldn't prioritize as a scientist one or the other, but I would say that maximal use of every opportunity from ground-based studies that do analog environments through suborbital projects and on-station projects all richly inform that mission when we do decide to go to Mars.
Thank you very much. To pursue that a little bit, because, you know, getting to Mars is fascinating, obviously, and what we might glean or be able to learn by, you know, that opportunity to explore it in greater detail fascinates me. But I can't help but recognizing the fact that this week I read in the press about the potential additional discovery of significant amount of planets. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
I am, yes.
I bet you are. And if you could elaborate on that, I would just be very grateful for your insight into what you think is happening, why they may have been missed prior, or I'm a lawyer, so I don't know. My dad's a doctor and my sister's a doctor, but I don't have your expertise, and that's why we appreciate you all being here today.
Well,
Or I do, for sure.
from my perspective, the discovery of additional planets and additional Earth-like planets is simply going to continue and continue at a very rapid rate. We're going to continue to find that there are more and more planets like ours and like Mars, the better our observation opportunities progress. I would not be surprised at all if we find that planets like ours are quite common in the universe, and don't be surprised the next time another handful of rocky Earth-like planets is discovered.
Well, if I could take it a bit further, we're on a line of questioning. What do you think the possibilities or probabilities are that those planets that are similar to Earth would have any kind of life similar to ours?
100%.
I would agree. I think I've always thought that it was almost arrogant to think that we're like the only thing moving around the entire universe.
Well, and again, I'd like to expand on that just a little bit, drawing more back.
But that's just a gut feel for me. For you, it's a scientific conclusion.
And drawing back to the matter at hand, as we take our biology, ourselves, the creatures that go with us as we go into space, we learn an awful lot about what it takes for life to move around the solar system, and therefore life moving around the universe. So the human exploration mission that NASA currently provides also richly informs a lot of our information on where we are in the universe, and tells us how easy, hard, difficult it is to move life around. So it does reach out to your question about what's out in the universe in terms of other planets as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Good questions. Thank you. Now I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think I may be the only one on the panel that was here when we approved the space station. And I think I was sitting way over there at that time. And I listened to all the arguments, and this was not a certainty that the space station would be approved. Because I remember that we were also trying to balance the budget at the time, and we had to take some budget considerations and put them into the debate. Can you tell us? Can anyone on the panel tell us how much has already been spent now on space station from the time we voted to move forward with the project?
As I said in my opening remarks, the number we have is $67 billion, and that includes this shuttle transportation cost, is our current estimate.
$57 billion.
Yes, 67.
Oh, 67, all right. Sorry, I came in about 50 minutes late here for the hearing today. Okay, and how much, if we maintain the space station, we decide to keep it in service, how much more will we be spending? Does anyone know that?
Yeah, we're spending about $3 billion per year on space station. That's made up of about $1.7 billion of transportation costs. Those are the 13% of the global launch market, 700 to 800 million for research, and then roughly about $1 billion for just operation cost of the station. That's U.S. costs. The international partners are also contributing to that overall.
I was going to ask how much do our partners contribute?
They're probably contributing the other three, probably roughly about $1 billion per year.
All of them together?
All of them together.
Okay. And how many partners do we have?
We have the Canadians, Japanese, and Russians, and Europeans.
Okay. Now, when we were being, and by the way, I voted for it. It won by one vote, and it was my vote, and I had, just so you'll know. There is one element here that people don't realize. I'm not sure if the scientific research that has been done on the International Space Station has justified the expense of the $67 billion that we're talking about. And I'm not sure that's the case. But we have had, there are other factors rather than just scientific research that come into play. And space station certainly renewed our national self-assuredness that we could do great things. And that has been, I think it's hard to just put a price tag on that. And when people are demoralized and they don't think they can do great things, they don't do great things. And that costs a certain amount of money. Let me also note the space station played and continues to play an important role in creating an image of peaceful cooperation between the two countries that were willing to destroy each other and destroy the planet for the 40 years prior to building the space station, namely the Soviet Union, which now has devolved away and is now Russia. But the example of Russian-American cooperation in space, there had been an attempt at it earlier on at a much smaller level, Skylab. But I think that Mr. Chairman, that we have to make sure that we understand that, especially in Russia, but in the United States as well, we have examples of now, even at this time, when tensions are very on the upswing now between Russia and the United States, that we have an example of cooperation of what we can do technologically rather than just building better technology of how to destroy one another. And so I would think that even though the promises, and I will add, there were many promises that cancer would be cured. I mean, I sat and listened to them. While I never did buy that, I hoped it would be true, but I never really counted on that. But I do think that we can say that when we write our history of what was accomplished in the last century, space station will be up there on the list of great accomplishments and of things that showed there is a better way for mankind. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you. And I agree with Mr. Rohrabacher. I think that the accomplishments of the space station are tremendous, and both scientifically as well as in connection with international relations. The ability of so many countries to work together, to cooperate, to, face challenges together, I think bodes well for us as humans, and hopefully we will continue to do that. Now, where I don't agree with him, and oftentimes that happens, is on the funding side of all of this. And he was here during the budget discussions for the lab. I was here during the budget discussions for the banks. And we were somehow able to come up with $800 billion over a weekend to save the financial system. And so when there is a priority, when there is a will, we can do a lot of things, whether it's an emergency or in a planned sort of setting. And I think we can maintain the laboratory and transition it to commercial operations and use over time and go to Mars. And so I would like to start with you, Dr. Dittmar, and just have you respond to sort of what I think we can do. And oh, by the way, I've always got to put my commercial up, which is to get to Mars by 2033. It says, we can do this.
I would, with the gentleman yield for 15 seconds.
To my friend from California, sure.
Just a reminder, I voted against the bailout of the banks.
Okay. Doctor.
I was going to be very disappointed if you didn't flash that bumper sticker, so thanks for doing that. I like your vision, of course. I've been at this for not as long as some people around the table, but enough of my life that I'm deeply invested in forward progress in space. To echo something that you said, Congressman Rohrabacher, I believe that aspiration is absolutely critical to advancing society and advancing the human condition. And I also believe that aspiring to do great things, the space station is certainly one of them. Moving into deep space is another one. Going to Mars, this is an extension of that. Aspiring to great things, especially great, truly great, daunting goals that we set ourselves to, forces us to advance not only our technology and our science, but the human condition. The International Space Station, in my view, is an exemplar of this for the reasons that have already been discussed here. Having been involved in it when the transition was really occurring for the Russians coming on board, I can tell you that I used to sit in meetings where I had the Japanese on one side and the Russians on the other side and the Americans in the middle, and this represents a range of cultures in a whole lot of different ways. And the intensity and focus of the individuals that are in that room to learn how to transcend language boundaries, cultural boundaries, technical boundaries, and figure out how to work together is a reason that the ISS has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and I hope will be again. Going forward to Mars is that times 100. It's a truly exciting goal, a very challenging goal. It will bring out the best of us in this country. There is no question in my mind but that the United States must lead that way forward. And I believe that it's worth the investment of our treasure and our resources and our commitment and our time over decades in order to be able to achieve that goal. I do believe it is achievable, and I think that we do have the resources to be able to reach it. We just have to choose to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Stallmer, go ahead.
I'd love to address that issue. I think at times when you look at cost, you have to look at intangibles. And sometimes numbers aren't always black and white. What $3 billion is, and the $3 billion of investment that this nation makes on the International Space Station per year, look at maybe where that $3 billion gets you at the Department of Defense. I can say that firsthand, working at the Pentagon, my colleague up there who also works with me on the reserves, how do we spend our dollars? And I think when you put it in that perspective, if it's a $3 billion a year investment on what we're doing in space, I would tell you that today there's no place I'd rather be in this world than in front of you, except for one other place. My daughter's first grade class is doing a field trip to the Air and Space Museum today, and I was supposed to chaperone it. But again, I'm here with you guys by choice.
What time you got to be there?
It's too late. It's too late. But they got there at 9. However, that being said, I get to talk to them enough, and I get to see the excitement in their face, and to look up above sometimes and to see the International Space Station with young people, and to talk about the things that they're doing up there and the vision that they have, that my daughter and my sons and this younger generation are going to have in space because of the investment, the $3 billion a year that we're spending. You know, there's some things I don't think you can put a price tag on, and I think that might be one of it. Now, in Congress, you got to put a price tag on everything, and I certainly understand that challenge. But I think the benefit that we're getting from an international perspective, from just a domestic perspective of our leadership in the world, I think is well worth the cost.
And I thank you. And we got to be smart with the people's money. No ifs, ands, or buts
Certainly.
about it. But the intangible investments that we're making, it's hard to quantify it, but we've got to consider that. So thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Now I recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for your testimony. I wonder if each of you could comment briefly on the impact of the Chinese station on commercial interests in low Earth orbit, and specifically, in what ways might a Chinese station compete with commercial platforms?
Again, that's difficult to predict exactly how that comes about or what happens, but we're also, you know, today as a national space station program, we have international agreements with all the countries I described earlier. And what works well there is we do a barter agreement where there's no exchange of funds between us and the other countries. So, for example, if the Europeans want to build a module, they do that investment in Europe, and then that module flies to the space station and is attached and is used for all of us. And it's the benefit of all the partners. So that's the basic model that the space station, the U.S. space station, operates under. I could imagine the Chinese space station doing the same thing. I can see other countries interacting with China, and if we don't have a U.S. space station, then that would be the only space station available essentially to go to for these agreements, and that could pull away from America's leadership in space and technology towards China. So I think it's important that we keep our focus. We use the private sector, as we've been doing before, to leverage the private sector as much as we can. That gives us a unique competitive advantage over other countries. But I think there is a threat from the Chinese and their potential relationship with other governments and other countries that our international leadership role could be diminished unless we have a very strong human presence in space at that time.
I don't have anything to add to that.
I would just add that I think it'll push us harder as a nation, as an industry, as a collective voice to work harder to achieve what we're looking to achieve in space. From a commercial perspective, I think there's a laundry list of ambitions that we want to do in space. So it would be a challenge in a competitive nature, I think.
And I can't speak to the commercial impacts, but I can tell you that leadership in science is an important thing for our science community. the role that the United States plays with regard to its current leadership, its current ability to point science in the right direction is a very, very important treasure that we would like to maintain.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veazey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and appreciate everything today. I wanted to ask about some of the key objectives in order of priority that argued for extending ISS operations until 2024, and what is the status of progress on meeting those objectives? Mr. Gerstenmaier.
One of the things that we needed to do is we need to understand how the human body performs, or how the physiology works in microgravity environments, so we can go further into space. We have 33 items that we track on a list, things such as bone loss, vestibular ability of the balance system, fluid shifts, those kind of things, tolerance to radiation. There's 33 items listed on that list, of which 22 are being actively mitigated or being investigated on board space station. So those 22 items are helping us with that activity. Then separate from that, we're testing life support systems. The Orion carbon dioxide removal system is on board the space station, has been operating, and we're testing that system that is needed. And then also, we're working with the commercial and private sector to expand the ability and commerce in space. You know, we have awarded some new contracts for cargo resupply to the space station. Sierra Nevada Corporation out of Colorado is going to be one of the providers for cargo in the future. They have a different vehicle that comes back and can actually land on a runway. We think that has some advantages to us in returning samples from space, not landing in a capsule in the water and then picking the vehicle up. So that's another thing that station's doing. It's helping expand and help commerce get more experience. We're also kind of teaching the private sector how to operate in space and build space stations and do those things. And then there's some very fundamental research activities on station that are very unique. There's the alpha magnetic spectrometer, which looks for dark matter, looks for kind of the high energy particles traveling through space. That research is truly fundamental in nature. We're about ready to fly an experiment called the Cold Atom Lab, which will be the coldest location in the universe, where we can essentially take a molecule and despin the molecule and look at basic physics principles. That can be done absolutely nowhere else in the world, and that's a pure fundamental research of basic physical science. And I'm sure some of the other members on the panel here can add some more, but those are the things that we said we would do between now and 2024, and those things that we're actively working on today as we go through the operations on space station every day.
Thank you. Dr. Dittmar, Mr. Stallmer, Dr. Ferl, anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in there just a little bit on a couple of the notions that Mr. Gerstenmaier put forth. One is that the science behind some of the technology challenges that he mentioned, for example, the fluid shifts in biological systems and the management of life support systems, involve physical and biological principles that are now being understood because of space station. In other words, the notion that you have to fix fluid shifts in humans is an interesting technological challenge. Understanding the reason behind them and how you might mitigate them before they occur is a scientific challenge. So too with the movement of fluids and particles in biological systems and in physical systems, such as the ecosystem that supports human respiration and function. The additional notion is that the ecology within a closed environment, such as the International Space Station, is a unique environment to study what happens when humans and their microbes and their plants and their entire life system are kept in closed quarters. And this informs a lot of clean building and other technologies here on Earth. But the other thing is that it is a scientific challenge to integrate across the biological and physical domains, not only to understand how to get into deep space, but just to understand them better, period.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Anybody else come in? Well, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. And so with that, this hearing is adjourned.